I have a few examples, but because I'm a body artist, I think that initially the idea of a body as a material can be relatively strange for some people. But when I'm performing, it's always already immediately read as a female body, even if the piece is not necessarily about being a woman. So in that way, I'm always working against the idea of what a female body can do or might do in an art space. Even if like that is not necessarily the concept of the work. But for a specific example, I made a piece in 2017 that was conjuring and directly addressing the idea of what it means to be a female or feminine or feminized body in the United States right now in the era of Trump. So as part of a collective of 100 artists in the Bay Area, there was an initiative mounted called 100 Days Action. And for that initiative, the organizers decided that they wanted to ask artists to kind of create a counter narrative for Trump's first 100 days in office. And people were working around many issues: migration, the environment, race and racism, everything that we're dealing with in the current political climate of the United States. And because I'm a durational performer and was thinking about the challenge to women's rights that this administration is threatening to constantly take away, and also the idea of not having access to healthcare, which is not only an issue for women, but also for many trans and queer people who use facilities that are typically seen as women's facilities to get hormones and medical care and advice, etc. So this piece is called Sloughing, and it was designed to specifically take on this issue not as a way of being in reaction to those threats to take away our rights, but as a way of claiming space for our body as its own site of power and claiming space for our body as its own site of power with and for each other, so not necessarily in reaction to. So the piece was a menstruation piece, and it was designed to be 28 days long. It was one of the first pieces that I designed as a performer who works with long periods of time that my body could not do alone. Because one of my fears was, how do we sustain a political movement? Not how do we show up to march for one day, but how do we actually do something for a significant amount of time? And for me, that is a very feminist space to hold like time and protests together for a significant duration. Somehow is a feminist project for me. So in the piece there are 2 foot by 2 foot plywood boards and menstruating bodies who may identify as female, who may identify as trans men, who may identify as genderqueer, but bodies that bleed, standing on the boards wearing blue collar shirts and bleeding for up to 3 hours for a public. So initially there was a lot of enthusiasm around getting this piece in some of the spaces that other artists that were part of the collective were starting to navigate and find space for. And it's already a difficult project because you're trying to work really quickly and within galleries in a system that has artists plan months in advance. So fully aware of that, I went to 24 meetings, very conscious that I would probably hear no more than I would hear yes. And I heard no at each meeting. I heard, we're really excited about your project. We absolutely believe in the politics, and there's no way that we could have a live menstruating body perform in our space. So I experienced the discrimination not only from the institutions that were sort of marketing themselves as champions of being tied to artistic projects that would remain radical and would remain political at this time, sort of saying, yes, we agree with your politics, but no, your body can't be here. So I experienced that and was also trying to hold that for the people who I was asking to perform in the work. And then also within the collective of very progressive-minded artists who were getting access to the spaces that one project wasn't allowed into. And so having to negotiate, well, what does that mean if there's a collective of artists and on the basis of gender, one group can't perform, what do we do? Because it's really important that all of these projects actually happen. And so it was a constant question and negotiation. And it was really interesting when then people said, well, so you just won't start. And I was thinking, like, what woman in the world ever waits for permission to start her art project? Because we would never have access to space. We would never make our work. We would go crazy trying to make the pieces that we constantly conceptualize. So we started in the street. Actually, we started at a friend's house for like a salon. And then there was a small gallery in Oakland run by 3 women who were going back and forth, like, yes, we can, no, we can't, yes, we can. And we finally were just like, yes, we can, we can. And so then when we were in Oakland for 3 days, and I'm so thankful for them, because once they sort of authorized the piece, some other places started to pay attention, but then we were really in the street again, and then we were in the street in the rain, and then we were in people's houses, and we were just sort of all over. Which became a really interesting dialogue about how and where female bodies are policed, patrolled, allowed to occupy space or not. That feels very resonant with my daily experiences in ways that I didn't even realize going into this performance. So that was a moment where it was everything at once. Because the piece is also very hard, because you are bleeding and you're relatively still and you're asking people to join you in that action. And sometimes it's really funny also. And sometimes people are feeling like they're not performing because it's not so significant. So all of the dialogues around it brought up not only kind of the discrimination that we were getting from the outside, but the ways in which our bodies had constantly been discriminated against for so long. So that's probably the most recent example that I can think of. Intersectionality is a foundational element of both my work as an artist and my work as a professor of performance. So in my artwork, I'm constantly thinking about not only gender, but economy and maybe what we would call a queer economy. So part of being a durational performer is about using time differently in ways that in ways that a capitalist society feels to be unproductive. And in making that kind of work, I am constantly creating spaces that I think both exceed and exhaust the boundaries of kind of one way of like putting a static narrative or identity onto a piece, because it's just not possible when it goes on and 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 on. So that's sort of one way that my work becomes very intersectional. In my teaching or in my sort of foundational politics that drive my work, Audre Lorde is really quoted for the you can't use the master's tools to build the house, or whatever the actual quote is. The master's tools aren't sufficient to build the house or something. But the second part of that quote that people don't actually ever talk about is that she says, writes in Sister Outsider, this is only scary for those who continue to define their worth in relation to this system of oppression. So for me, intersectionality is very much about that idea of taking difference as a strength and figuring out how to create community and space around that strength versus constantly looking toward something that we already know is oppressive to authenticate our existence as artists or to recognize our work as art. It's very dominant still. I was recently in New York, and they were going through their permanent collection to showcase feminist art, and there was a Guerrilla Girls poster that was put up. This was in the Brooklyn Museum of Art. There was a Guerrilla Girls poster that was put up. That's one of the lesser known Guerrilla Girls poster. I hadn't seen it, or it hadn't been in my recent memory. And it says, you're seeing less than half of the picture, because you're not showing work by women, and you're not showing work by women of color, and you're not showing work by queer identified people. And the fact that this poster is made 40 years ago and it still feels very real is not shocking, but notable. That's one thing that I think of. The second thing I think of is Carolee Schneemann passed away 2 days ago. And I teach in my manifesto class her Women in the Year 2000 manifesto, which was written in 1977. So in 1977, Carolee Schneemann tells us, there will be an art history. So she's taking away the idea of a his that owns these things. There will be women taught, and there will be women teaching other women these things. That's 1977, a projection for the year 2000. I often start my first day of teaching asking students if they can name female artists. And I often have students who cannot. Students who are studying painting, sculpture, ceramics, also architecture, design, etc. So that's notable because we're almost 20 years beyond the 1977 manifesto. And then in my experience making work in San Francisco, I constantly leave shows where I feel let down that there wasn't more attention given to a wider context of artists that could be included under this given theme or within this historical context. And it's not only that I don't see female artists represented, it's that when I do see female artists represented, they're not anchored by their contemporaries who are also female. They're anchored by the white male artists who sort of surround or somehow can elevate this one work to the level of being included in the show. And what we know is that art happening on the ground doesn't function that way. It doesn't mean that the male artists who are being shown are obsolete in that picture, but the idea that they're directing the conversation leaves out less than half of the picture, as the Guerrilla Girls poster said. So San Francisco still has a lot of work to do, as does much of the United States. However, I would say there are a lot of female artists in the United States who have, instead of elevating their own careers, created spaces for art that they want to see, which may not always fall into that category of art that's dominated by a white cis male population. That I think is starting to disappear in San Francisco because of economic reasons and how difficult it is to hold space. But there are amazing curators and women working really hard to keep those spaces intact in San Francisco, and also in New York, and also in Boston, and also in Los Angeles. So if you look to the more experimental spaces or the smaller spaces, or even the fact that, you know, like Women's House, you know, the idea that we can, what defines a space and what does recognition mean? If we start to focus again on the salon or the house or the living room as a legitimate space for art making, then I think you can start to see a lot of female work. Of course, we're doing all of that labor for free. So that's a concern as far as the sustainability for our life, our quality of life, our ability to keep making work. Those are just all sort of questions or ideas percolating in my head when we start to think about visibility and representation, because I think my desire would be to shift our own economic association with spaces, with the big museums, towards like buying our friends' art and having more salons and thinking about who we want to, like what kind of art we want to see and how we can get it out there in the world, even if it's just like a small bar or, you know, someone's kitchen. And at the same time, I know that it's really important that we can figure out ways to sustain artistic lives as women and queer women and women of color. So those are all like problems, but there are also other possibilities that I think we could work toward. Yes.